I'm the Vice President at the Association of the United States Army and a proud member of the Aspen Institute Homeland Security Group. The United States Army, a national institution older than the Republic itself, dating from 1775, celebrated its 243rd birthday last month. Your Army is a force of 1.4 million regular Army, Army National Guard, and Army Reserve volunteer soldiers, Department of the Army civilians, and their families. With over 180,000 soldiers deployed forward or forward stationed or otherwise supporting U.S. operations in 140 countries, and with a presence in virtually every hometown in America, the United States Army is truly a global force. Now in its 17th year of sustained overseas operations, including extended combat operations, counterinsurgency operations, and now security force assistance missions, the U.S. Army has been asked to do more over a longer period of time than any time in its long history. In the homeland, America's Army is the principal military force providing robust and sustained timely support when called to a host of federal agencies and partners, especially in the Department of Homeland Security, as well as at the state and local level. Today, the Army faces challenges, however, not unlike building an airplane in flight, as it continues to sustain operations around the world while increasing its readiness for the inevitable but as yet unknown future operations which may be at the higher end of the spectrum of conflict. All of this is occurring during a period of unprecedented, and I might add, innovative organizational and institutional reform in the Army, all with the eye toward putting the most professional, best-led, best-equipped land force into the field and to give America's sons and daughters every advantage possible to fight and win on our behalf. It's a pretty heavy lift, as you can imagine, and of course, in any organization, the most successful organizations, that the top ingredient is leadership. And today, that is the case as we have the Secretary of the Army, Dr. Mark T. Esper, the top civilian leader in the Army, as our guest. Dr. Esper brings a remarkably wide array of skills and experiences to this position. He's been a soldier with the unique distinction of serving in all three components of the U.S. Army. He was a regular Army officer in Operation Desert Storm with the 101st Airborne Division. He's been in the Virginia and D.C. National Guard. And finally, he retired out of the Army Reserve in 2007. On Capitol Hill, Dr. Esper served as a national security advisor to Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist and later to Senator Chuck Hagel. He's been a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee and on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In the Pentagon, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Negotiation Policy and as an Army staff planner. In the private sector, he was a senior executive at the Raytheon Company for 7 years before answering the call last November to return to the Army as its senior civilian official. Secretary Esper is a proud West Point graduate in the great class of 1986. Courage never quits, along with his classmate, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He holds a Master in Public Administration from the Kennedy School at Harvard and a PhD in Public Policy from George Washington University. To moderate today's discussion, we have an equally skilled professional and a true defense and security expert in her own right. All of you know Catherine Herridge, the award-winning chief intelligence correspondent for Fox News. What you may not know is that she is a charter member of this august symposium, having served as a moderator for all 9 iterations of the Aspen Security Forum. Before I turn the floor over to Catherine, let me close with a personal note. As a career Army officer and soldier for life, parent of a young officer, and as a citizen, I've never been prouder of my Army and your Army than I am today. And with that, would you please join me in a warm welcome for the 23rd Army Secretary, Mark Esper, and Catherine Herridge. Go Army, beat Navy.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Guy, for the kind introduction. I'd like to take a moment and recognize the hard work of the Aspen Institute, Clark and Irvin, Rob Walker, their team, John Hogan, Deb Cunningham. This has been an extremely successful event. Every year, I find it hard to imagine that the next year will be even more thought-provoking, but that's been true again today, so thank you very much. Our topic this morning is the Army and the future vision. And this is one of the most transformative events for the Army since 1973. And what's astonishing to me is that the vision for the Army is on a single piece of paper, back and front, drafted by the Secretary. And what I know as a reporter is that it tells me that there's a real vision, but I think more importantly that there is a clarity of vision. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us in person or remotely. The Secretary and I are going to have a conversation, a wide-ranging conversation for 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. And we'll begin with a few brief remarks from the Secretary.
Well, good. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for that introduction. I would also like to thank Aspen for hosting this wonderful forum and for the introduction by Guy Swan. Thank you for that as well. Beat Navy. Let me just say a few things up front. First of all, the Army is at a strategic inflection point, one that requires bold, big change. And so with that, I want to reassure or assure you all of three things. First of all, the Army is ready today to deploy, fight, and win anytime, anywhere, against any foe. Second, I believe we have the vision, the leadership, the initiatives, everything we need in place to make sure we are able to accomplish that mission in years ahead, in decades ahead. And third, the renaissance, if you will, is underway today across a number of fronts to make sure that we implement that vision and are ready to fight those future fights. And I know we can talk about any one of those threads today, but I just want to lay that out for you up front in terms of what my assessment is of where we are and where we're going. Thank you.
Okay, so one of the big themes at the conference this year has been Russia. And one of the touchstones for the vision is the concept of near-peer competitors. So let's begin with Russia. How does the U.S. Army sort of rack and stack against the Russians?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that the National Defense Strategy that was published earlier this year that tells us in the future we're going to need to be prepared for high-intensity conflict, and that we should look at strategic competitors such as China and Russia as the ones to pace ourselves against. So in that regard, I will say, as I just mentioned, we are ready for any type of threat today. And that readiness that we bring to the table, that lethality, it helps us ensure that we can assure our allies today and also deter any type of Russian bad behavior. In the meantime, as we implement our vision, we want to make sure that we can, across a number of fronts, ensure we have overmatch in a number of areas to make sure that we are capable of dealing with Russia and eventually China over that longer period of time.
And in terms of Russia with the overmatch, is the view that if we have dominance, which we have now over Russia, that it also gives us an edge for those countries that rely on Russia, like Iran, either for equipment, training, and strategy?
It does. If you look at what we've identified as 6 modernization priorities, and in each of those 6, we're confident that if we can extend our overmatch in those areas, it will give us a clear advantage on the modern battlefield, and not just against Russia, but also against any of their proxies, any countries that may buy their types of goods and materials. Iran comes to mind as an example. So we're confident if we can meet and address that pacing threat in the near term, we'll be quite capable of accomplishing our mission on any other type of battlefield.
As we all know, with competition, it's important to have the skill advantage, but it's also important to understand your adversary's weaknesses and how to exploit those weaknesses. So looking at Russia, what would you identify as the weaknesses and ways in which the U.S. Army can exploit those weaknesses?
You know, I like to look at Russia in the context of the Army's strengths. And when I look across a number of factors, I feel very good about where we are. So first of all, people. I think man to man, woman to woman, we got far superior persons. They're smart, they're innovative, they're tough. They have all those types of skills and attributes that are critical on any type of battlefield. Second, I think that in terms of our equipment, our technologies we bring to bear, I'll put my money any day of the week on American business, on our defense companies, on our innovative industries to provide our soldiers the tools, the weapons, the equipment they need to fight and win in that future conflict. And then, of course, we have great allies. They're capable. We have they far greater number than what Russia possesses. So that's a third area where I think we have, again, another advantage. And then we can go on in terms of any other number of factors. But again, when I look at the balance of factors here on both sides, I like the card. I like the hand we're playing right now. And I think our challenge, again, is to grow it, to expand it, to make sure that we're more lethal, more ready on those future battlefields.
If you read the Army vision, what you'll see in terms of near-term competitors is also China. So what does conflict look like with China in 2028? How do you prepare the Army for a potential conflict?
You know, first of all, as we think about future challenges, future threats, we see in the immediate near term, what's right in front of us, of course, is North Korea. Over the 5 to 15-year period, we see Russia as our pacing threat, if you will. So we look to them in terms of their formations, their tactics, their equipment, those things that they would bring to bear against us. But the long-term threat is clearly China. That's the strategic competitor that we look to, because the economic power of that country, the size, its ambitions, all those things are why we're focused and why the National Defense Strategy tells us to focus on the People's Republic as the longer term, the greater threat. That said, more often than not, experts will say the future engagement with China will be in the South China Sea or somewhere in the maritime domain, and that may be likely. But you never know where conflict will happen. It could be in the maritime domain, it could be in the air, it could be in the ground. If you look across the world, particularly in Asia, most militaries, their predominant force is the ground forces. So we got to be capable to fight, again, anywhere across that region. But more importantly, I think, in the near term, as we develop doctrine, and I know you want to talk about doctrine, multi-domain operations, we want to make sure we can support the Air Force and Navy, our joint partners, in any type of fight. And so in a maritime fight, that may mean employing Army artillery, using hypersonic weapons at long range to either hold off a maritime threat from the PRC or to even neutralize it. And so that's the way we're thinking about that type of threat. I'll give you a good example. It was in the news this week. So in an exercise that was occurring in the Pacific, in PACOM, we had a AH-64 Apache helicopter employing an unmanned drone forward of its location to identify a target ship, from which it then relayed the coordinates, the data, back to an Army-based rocket system, as well as a naval strike force. And that Army system was enabled to launch a rocket that hit the supposed enemy vessel. That's a great example of multi-domain warfare in terms of how we're thinking about supporting our service partners in the Air Force and Navy, Marine Corps.
How long has it been since the Army sunk a ship like that?
I don't think I know my history well enough. War of 1812, I don't know.
But on a serious note, is that the role you see, or a significant role that the Army would play in the Pacific?
Well, we have to. I think it's, again, we are a joint force. In my day, I grew up under air-land battle. By its own definition, air-land meant we needed to learn to fight under air, in the air and on the land. Today, multi-domain warfare means multiple things. It's air, land, it's sea, it's cyberspace, it's outer space, and it's across the electronic warfare spectrum. So we have to have capabilities across all those spectrums, all those domains, and we have to train, educate, develop the leaders that can think across them and employ lethal effects to make sure that we accomplish our mission.
I mean, it's very well understood in the open source reporting that China has been extremely successful in terms of stealing intelligence and business secrets. What's the impact?
Well, it means that they can get to a capability quicker than they would have otherwise. You know, the military over the years has spent a great sum of money investing in future technologies, doing its own research, spent a lot of time. And if they get the advantage by stealing our technology to do that quicker, that only impacts us. That closes that gap that then we have to re-extend and maintain through an extension. So there's a lot of effort going into protecting our technology from cyber theft, from other types of espionage, to make sure we can, again, retain that gap, that overmatch that we need to fight and win on the battlefield. And more importantly, if the enemy knows we can fight and win, it has a great deterrent effect so that we never get to a conflict in the first place.
You mentioned North Korea earlier with so many operational commitments and modernization, which is happening in a very dynamic environment. How do you juggle a North Korea in that?
Well, that's been the focus of our efforts so far. So when we think about readiness, that's the Army's #1 priority right now. We think about how do I make sure that my units are fully manned, my equipment's ready to go, I have sufficient munitions, and the training that we need to fight and win on that battlefield is happening. So the Army's taken great effort over the past couple years under the exceptional leadership of the Chief of Staff, General Mark Milley, to make sure we're prepared and ready to go, and I can tell you we are, if worse comes to worse. But that means, again, making sure that we are ready in all those particular areas to do that. And we've put a lot of focus across all three components, those three components now being regular Army, National Guard, and the reserves to do that. I had the great privilege of coming here yesterday from Indiana, where I spent time with the Indiana National Guard. And they are leaning forward in terms of making sure they are ready if the balloon goes up to deploy and accomplish their mission. And again, everywhere I go, as I visit soldiers around the world, I hear the same thing.
I don't know if I hear this in your voice, but when you talk about North Korea, sort of the weight or the gravity of that problem set, I can hear that when you talk about it.
No, it is. It would be a big fight, a bloody fight, and it's one best avoided if you can, and that's why we need to put a lot of effort into our diplomacy. And I think what the Army provides is it gives our diplomats that assurance, that confidence that the U.S. military is standing there behind them. My last job in the Army on regular duty was to be a war planner for the Pacific Theater of Operations. So I know well that fight from 35 years ago back to today. And again, it's a tough fight. We have great partners with the Republic of Korea, and I'm sure other allies would join in such an effort. But it's important that we stand firm with regard to supporting our friends and allies in that region.
You have a phrase I've seen you use publicly, which is the best way to win a war is to prepare.
Right.
Tell us why that rings true to you.
Well, there's so many different spin-offs on that saying, but yeah, the best way to avoid a war, to prevent a war, is to be prepared to fight and win one. And I think that's been true through the ages. I mean, President Reagan used to say peace through strength. So if you have the strength, you can maintain the peace. And I think that's the path we're on. I think Secretary of Defense Mattis really articulates that and embodies that in terms of what he's given us in terms of his expectations of myself and the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of the Air Force. And that is our charge, is to make sure we are ready to go to support the Commander-in-Chief, our diplomats, whatever the case may be. And that's where the Army's push is right now. That's today. Back to the vision. We need to make sure we're ready to fight 5, 10, 15 years from now. My job as a secretary is to look out to the future. Mm-hmm. If I don't do that, who will? And so that's why I put a lot of effort into thinking, how do I get from here, where we are today, to 10, 15 years from now? And where do I place my time, my priorities, my emphasis to make sure that we are in that spot 10 years hence?
And one of the main focuses is the Futures Command. Not everyone here may be familiar with the Futures Command. Let's have an explanation and what you think the sort of short or long-term objectives are. Sure.
Well, there are several major lines of effort, I believe, and if we are to achieve our vision by the year 2028. One is personnel. We can talk about that. Another one is readiness and training. Another one is modernization of the force. And so, as many of you know who've watched the Army over the years, we've had great successes when it comes to equipping our soldiers, and we've had some big failures. And frankly, we can't afford to do that anymore. We can't afford to lose the time. We can't afford to spend billions of dollars and to end up with nothing, particularly when our soldiers' lives are at stake or the mission accomplishment. And part of the challenges, as we learned over the years through studies, congressional hearings, and whatnot, is that a major problem is that the Army's modernization enterprise is spread out across multiple commands, different reporting units, whatever the case may be. And so if you want to find accountability in the service when it comes to modernization, you can't. There's not one person in charge. You have to go to multiple people, and so accountability is a big challenge. So the path we set off on some time ago and just recently implemented was the establishment of Army Futures Command. It's the biggest organizational change in the Army since 1973, when we stood up Forces Command, which provides the force, and Training and Doctrine Command, which trains and educates and recruits the force. So we have gone now from three major commands, Forces Command, Training and Doctrine Command, and Army Material Command, and we've now added a fourth, Futures Command. Futures Command is simply this. It has to think about the future strategic warfighting environment. It has to then think through what do we need to win in that environment, conceptualize the ideas, the material, the equipment, bring it all the way forward through research, development, into training, into testing and evaluation, work with our acquisition experts to build it and then deliver it to the field. And for once, we have unity of command and unity of effort because we have one general now in charge, we'll have one general in charge of doing that. And that's, first of all, that's one of the most significant changes we made. It attacks one of the main problems we've had in the past, well, with regard to accountability. And third, another major area where we've fallen short in the past is what's called the requirements process. We now have one person responsible for deciding what are the requirements we need in a particular weapon system, what are the attributes, and he can make those trade-offs so that we get to the endpoint much more quickly and not burn a lot of time as we have in the past. We used to take 5 to 7 years just to figure out what we wanted to build, let alone build it, and that used to take 10 to 15. By that time, and in this era, you've fallen behind a couple generations, and so we want to reduce that back down from concept to delivery within 5 to 7 years.
And Lieutenant General John Murray.
Right.
Right. Why is he the right guy for this job?
Well, he brings to bear a lot of attributes. Now, he's not yet there. He has to go before the Senate and get confirmed. We have the utmost confidence that he will. But he has a great background. He's a warfighter, first of all, an infantry officer who commanded the 3rd Infantry Division. He's commanded in combat, so he sees the world from a warfighter's lens. But also, he brings to bear 3 years now working on the Army staff as the G8, which means he's responsible for requirements. He knows up front what it takes, what the Army needs to build these future capabilities. He's been involved in the requirements and the acquisition process, if you will. And beyond that experience, I will tell you he's a very smart and thoughtful person. He has the confidence of myself and the Chief of the Staff of the Army. He's known in D.C. He will be a good communicator, a good articulator of what the command will do and where it needs to be and go. And so we have great confidence in his leadership. As the first commander, he'll get it off on the right foot and get it headed in the right direction.
I'd like to get into some detail and granularity about the half-dozen modernization objectives. First and foremost, and you touched on it earlier, is long-range precision fires. What does that look like? What's the capability? And what's the timeline for 1.0?
Right. Well, let me just say first, we do have 6 modernization priorities. They've been in place now for a year. If you're in industry, I will tell you they will not change. That's been one of the problems in the past. We tend to change our priorities, but the Chief of Staff and the Vice Chief of Staff and the Undersecretary and I have sworn a blood oath that they will not change. If one tries to change them, we're all going to turn around and choke him down and get back on the 6.
That's incentive.
It is incentive. But it's important to communicate what our priorities are because it's key to industry, and not just traditional defense industry, but the non-traditional industry, and we can talk about that in the context of Futures Command. But also the Army know where we're going and why, and we focus our efforts in that direction, not bouncing around year to year across a number of fronts. So, long-range precision fires is number 1. There are 6 of them. We could talk about the other 5. But that was critical because we need to re-extend the gap between us and strategic competitors such as Russia and China in terms of our ability to reach out and touch the enemy with indirect fire, whether it's rocket or artillery, at great distances. And we have a number of initiatives underway, at least 3, where we have a cannon that can do that, a 155 mobile cannon, if you will, howitzer on the battlefield that will really return to our maneuver forces the ability to shoot quickly at long range. But the other one, the exciting one, is hypersonics. And we're working closely with our sister services on this, but the ability to really engage enemy forces at hundreds of miles, if not 1,000 miles. And that capability is critical not only to the Army's fight, but to that multi-domain operation that we spoke about, whether it is helping the Air Force by suppressing enemy air defenses at great distance, which allows them to help them achieve air superiority, or as I mentioned before, engaging enemy Navy assets at great distances from the shore, again, provides another capability that our adversaries will have to deal with. And that's why it's top of the list for the Army.
So what does a next generation combat vehicle look like?
Well, we don't know
Is this where
yet.
robotics, is this where robotics may come in?
Yes. There are a number of areas in terms of these 6 priorities that will really require cutting-edge technologies. With regard to long-range precision fires, it's hypersonics. With regard to air missile defense, it's directed energy. And with regard to next-generation combat vehicle, for example, it's robotics and artificial intelligence. I will steal one of the Chief of Staff of the Army's lines when he says, we are at a point right now where technology has the potential to fundamentally change the character of warfare. Not the nature of warfare, but the character of warfare, particularly with regard to AI and robotics. And the key is whoever gets there first will have unmatched lethality on the battlefield for some years to go after that. So what we're trying to think of, what the Army vision calls for, is that by the year 2028, we begin deploying a next-generation combat vehicle, at least a replacement for the Bradley, that employs not just advanced technologies on it, but has the ability to be operated semi-autonomously, if not fully autonomously. So what you can imagine is on the battlefield, let's imagine a company of mechanized infantry or armor that can now deploy unmanned fighting vehicles ahead of its manned formation with the ability, which much less concern for risk, to fix the enemy, engage the enemy, while the manned forces maneuver to seize the objective. And so these are critical technologies. The Army is putting is shifting a lot of its research and technology investment monies in that direction. We have our folks who think about future warfare also working along these same lines to envision how we would fight along that. But again, whoever gets there first will have an advantage, and we want to be there first. And I tell you, we will get there first.
And the advantage is being, at least from a layperson's perspective, a robotic tank is lighter, smaller, cheaper, more disposable.
Right.
Less risk to human capital.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about one of the critical factors for the Army is the ability to get to the fight strategically. So if I don't have the requirement to put persons inside a vehicle, I now can reduce the size of the vehicle because there's not a crew compartment. I can reduce the weight because I don't have to armor it up. And if you look at those two factors alone, it now increases my strategic mobility. I can put more of those on a ship or on a C-17 and get them to the battlefield quicker. And as you mentioned, because I don't have people, I'm much less concerned about putting them in a risky situation. I can maybe engage deeper, I can get closer to the enemy, and I can really upset the enemy's game plan, battle plan, in ways that I can't do with a manned vehicle. And then think about how do you integrate that with drones we plan on employing as well. It is a game changer with regard to how you fight.
Is the concept of operating a robotic tank similar to operating a drone? It would be from a base here in the United States, or how would that work?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that you could operate remotely from anywhere at a great distance, or right, behind your forward line of your own troops. Those are some of the concepts we need to work out. But what's interesting is I've dug into this, and I've visited some of our experts in Detroit, Michigan at TARDEC at TACOM, and I've talked to others around about this issue. The difference is, it's one thing to fly a drone through the air, and I don't want to dismiss the technological challenges of that, but it's something else to have a unmanned vehicle navigate terrain. Because now you have to figure out, is that thing in front of me, is that a table or is that a bush? Is that a trench I have to go in, and can I get back out of it? All those things that a human driver makes, instantaneously, and now a robot has to navigate that and have the algorithms, the computing power do that. That's just the first hurdle. The second hurdle is now I have to navigate that terrain, and I have to navigate it in a formation of blue forces, right? So friendly vehicles. That's challenge number 2. So I have to keep in mind who's on my left, right, and front and rear. Number 3, I have to navigate that terrain, keeping in mind where the enemy might be. So how do I use the terrain as I navigate? Do I move behind a copse of trees or through a defilade position? And then the biggie. Once I've accomplished those 3 things, how do I navigate against an enemy force? How do I maneuver on the battlefield? These are big challenges that an airborne aircraft doesn't have to deal with necessarily. And so that's why it's going to be difficult, certainly for full autonomy. For semi-autonomy, I think we can get there. I know we can get there by 2028. But full autonomy is much more challenging.
Does artificial intelligence play a role in this?
Absolutely. I mean, artificial intelligence will help enable the autonomy we need in the near term. So yes, and that's why we're putting a lot of effort into that, why DoD is. All the services. Again, that is one of the critical technologies that will change the character of warfare.
What's being a human being? I'd like to think humans sort of have the last word here with artificial intelligence. Where do you think that line is, where sort of the positives of artificial intelligence kind of end and the human has to kind of come in?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I think in some ways you can have speed of decision making. You can have much less risk aversion in terms of where you would employ a robot as compared to a human being. And we see that happening now. with regard to airborne surveillance. But I believe there will always be a person in the loop, if you will, to make those final decisions with regard to whether you engage or not engage an adversary. So I think we're quite a ways away from that, but I think that'll be key going forward.
We probably have time for maybe one more on the list, and I'll give you the choice here. It's future vertical lift, the network, air and missile defense, and then soldier lethality.
Geez, all four, which one?
Okay, two.
I got to go with soldier lethality,
okay,
because I was an infantryman, served a lot of time in infantry units in the 82nd and 101st. So it's close to my heart because, as been pointed out, in any conflict, the infantry, whether you're Marine or Army, bears the brunt of the battle. 80% of the battlefield casualties are borne by the infantry, and yet we probably put fewer dollars per person into that than we do any other system. And so we're putting a great deal of money now into the soldier lethality. This is personal to the Secretary of Defense as well. It's a passion of his, it's a passion of mine, is how do we make sure our soldiers are better trained, more prepared, more lethal on the battlefield, so we can reduce that rate of attrition on the battlefield. We can empower them to be much more capable. So we have a number of things underway right now. We're building a rifle that is much more capable in terms of engaging the enemy at greater distances, defeating whatever armor they may be bearing, and doing so with, with reducing the soldier load. That's number one. Number two, we are developing, and I've actually used them, the Secretary's used them, a new set of night vision goggles that provides a great deal of capability on a soldier screen. It'll be linked to the weapon to give him or her lethality on the battlefield, and again, improve the survivability, but also the lethality of the soldier. And what's really neat about this is that these goggles will allow us to train in a virtual environment, any place, anytime, anywhere. It links the soldiers within our squad. You can literally take a room like this, empty it out. You could put into that screen, in terms of their vision, a enemy battlefield, maybe a village in Afghanistan, and you can go room to room, house to house, and clear that by talking with one another, getting immediate feedback, and then doing that repetition, that series, over and over and over again. As anybody knows, the key to success, to proficiency, is repetition. And we will give our soldiers great deals of repetition. You and I saw each other in the gym today. Key to success for fitness.
You were running faster than I was, and lifting much more. I know that.
The key is repetition, though.
Okay,
right. getting to that gym every day,
tip.
And getting to the gym every day, and when you're there, doing as many repetitions as you can. That's what we want to give to the soldier, is to put these sets on and go anywhere, anytime, in your barracks, in the courtyard, in a conference room. Take it with you, and do repetition after repetition after repetition, whether it's react to contact, react to ambush, react to indirect fire, all those type of battle drills I grew up with. It really will improve the proficiency, the cohesion, the teamwork of that unit, and really give them an unmatched advantage on the battlefield.
All of these points take us to the idea of multi-domain battlefield or conflict. How do you define that?
Well, a multi-domain gets back to where I said when I entered the service after leaving the academy in 1986, we had air-land battle, which was a great concept. If you go back to, let's go back a little bit, because I mentioned up front that we are at a strategic inflection point, and it's important to look at the history. So in 1973, we came out of the Vietnam War, and we had just finished, 10 years of irregular warfare conflict. We knew that the big fight was really against the Soviets in the Fulda Gap in Germany. We knew we had to build a force that could fight high-intensity conflict. We were unsure of what our budgets may be. We were unsure of what our doctrine may be. And so we had some great leaders at that time, men like General Creighton Abrams, who could see the future. And what they did was set the Army on a path, on a course that gave us the Army that beat Iraq in the Gulf War and beat Iraq again during the 2003 invasion. And what did they do? They created air-land battle doctrine. They invested in the Big Five Army systems that we still use today, right? The Abrams, the Bradley, the Patriot, the Black Hawk, those types of systems. They gave us the National Training Center, which anybody would say has been a remarkable success in terms of our ability to train and fight on the modern battlefield. And if I hadn't mentioned, they gave us the doctrine of air-land battle and a great generation of leaders. So we had a force that was prepared to defeat the Soviets in the Fulda Gap. That threat fell away, and the fourth largest army in the world happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And we beat them pretty badly in Desert Shield, Desert Storm. That's the point that we're at today. So today, as we think ahead, if we could replicate that, if we can have that type of success they had in '73, we will be overwhelmingly successful. So as we look at doctrine, now we're looking at multi-domain. How do we fight not just in the air and land, but again, sea, space, cyberspace, across the electronic warfare spectrum? 2 or 3 of those spaces were not there when I was a young lieutenant. We didn't have cyberspace, and we certainly didn't think about sinking enemy ships. But that's where we need to go, because I think one of the virtues of the U.S. military is we fight as a joint force. We're able to create a very lethal military that its capabilities are greater than the sum of its individual forces by the fact that we work together, we fight together. And so that is the key, is how do we train officers to think more flexibly, use greater judgment, innovate on the battlefield, to think about it, well, how can I help the Air Force? How can I support the Navy? And this is something that Secretary Wilson and Secretary Spencer and I talk a great deal about. We talk about sharing technologies, sharing research all the time to further that concept.
This is also the realm of information warfare. This is where Russia has shown itself to be very adept.
They have, and it's an asymmetric capability they pursued because of the strength of our conventional forces. But we need to counter that as well. So, one of the pleasant surprises I found coming into the Army, back into the Army in November, as I made my way around the service and traveled, is to find that we are really leading the way in terms of our cyber capabilities. So the Army has built a cyber core, a cyber MOS. We have a cyber center of excellence at Fort Gordon, Georgia, that I was able to visit a couple months ago. We have cyber teams across the regular Army and the National Guard that are today fighting bad guys in Afghanistan. And so we are really moving out in that area. A lot of it is a testament to some great leaders in the Army. I know we got General Nakasone out here who's led in that way. And so I'm really pleased where we're going with cyber. There's much more to do. It's a field we need to learn more about. And same thing with information operations. It's one area where we need to be prepared to fight and win.
Let's talk about human capital. What are your objectives for growing the Army, the timeline, and are you good where you are right now on retention, or do you want to see improvements there?
With regard to the vision, what we outlined is this: that I believe in the coming years we need to grow the force above 500,000 soldiers with associated growth in the Guard and Reserve. And as we grow that force, we need to make sure that they're tough, they're physically fit, they're innovative young men and women capable of fighting a modern, dynamic, high-intensity conflict. And so that's where we're trending. And so when I talked up front about a renaissance underway in the Army, I say that because there are a number of initiatives underway right now that we've taken to make sure that we build that force. So recently we announced that we would extend infantry one-station unit training, which means the basic training that soldiers go through plus their additional infantry training before they ever arrive to unit. We extended that from 14 weeks to 22 weeks. 2 months we've extended it. We want to make sure that our young infantrymen coming out of Fort Benning, if you will, are the best trained recruits in the world, best trained infantry recruits in the world. And we're going to expand that to armor and cavalry and hopefully eventually artillery and engineers. Because what we hear from the field is we need to make sure that these soldiers are ready to go from day one, from the time they arrive in the operational unit. So that's one thing, big change in the Army. It's been that way for decades. Number two, we just recently announced that we're changing the Army physical fitness test to what we call the Army Combat Fitness Test. The APFT has been in place since 1980. I grew up with it. I think many folks who served will know that it's just not a good representation or a good driver of combat fitness. This new 6-event timed test has an 80% degree of certainty, if you will drive the combat fitness we need for our soldiers. It's a very demanding type of exam, but it's going to bring our soldiers to a new level of physical fitness. At the same time, we believe reduce injuries. So those are just 2 ways by which we're trying to build this more capable, lethal fighting force from the soldier level up.
How many of you here this morning have been in the military, have a close family member who's in the military, children, grandchildren? So it's about 3/4 of the room. As someone who's in a military family, I have some skin in the game. And as you know, military kids have been a real base for recruitment. But since 9/11, these kids have been through multiple deployments with their family members. And as we sometimes know, deployments are no Hallmark card. Has this impacted recruitment from military families? Is it a positive, or has it been a drag on that process?
Well, you lived through this, so I thank you for your sacrifice. And you know, my wife, we've been married 29 years, and for the 21 years I was in the service, she was with me for 21 of them. And I will tell you that I know well, as do any former soldiers out here, that the families pay the biggest price. They sacrifice the most. It's the unknown that really is the driver. So I thank you on that behalf. But yeah, I mean, my big concern, the big strategic national concern I have, is that the military is in some ways becoming a family business, and it's increasingly isolated from the broader society it serves. So whenever I have the chance to swear in new soldiers, I like to tell them that you are the 1% defending the other 99%. And it sounds great, and I really appreciate young men and women coming to serve. It's remarkable in this day and age, and hopefully I can recruit your son.
He's been, you know, indoctrinated at West Point since he could, about 3 or 4, so.
Yeah, how old is he?
He's 13, and he can tell you more about the evolution of machine guns than maybe you ever want to know.
So I told Catherine I was going to come over her house and swear him in. Delayed entry program. 5 years, right? 6 years,
right.
whatever the case may be, but we'll get him on board. Right. But it's becoming a family business in some ways, and what it tells you a couple things. One is there is increasing isolation, lack of familiarity between the broader community and the military that serves them. Mm-hmm. But secondly, it tells you that the children of persons who serve really see a career that's exciting, that offers a lot of opportunity, a lot of professional growth, a lot of personal growth, and these kids are fantastic. They're very resilient. I can't go around the Army. I can go around the Army staff and tell you almost all of the persons serving have sons and daughters who are serving themselves, and many, it's all their children. So it's quite remarkable what you see. But again, while I applaud that and respect their service, I am concerned about the broader relationship between the military and the public, the nation it serves, and trying to think through how do we close that gap? How do we go out and message that and tell folks that, you know, the Army, or any service, if you will, but the Army is a great place to serve. We'll teach you a lot of wonderful skills. We'll prepare you to be fantastic young men and women, good leaders, that whatever path you choose, you'll be successful.
And if there's a sort of a better understanding or stronger relationship for the families that are moving every 2 years or every 3 years, there may be more opportunities in the community for their spouses to work because there's a better understanding of what the requirements are.
Well, we talked about this. One of the issues that I'm really focused on are the families. It was one of the priorities I outlined when I came back in on day one, and in particular the hiring of our spouses. And this was a personal problem my wife confronted. She couldn't get a job because private sector employers knew that she would be moving every 2 or 3 years. In fact, I think in our first 5 years we were married, we moved 5 times. And so it's tough. But at the same token, there are things that we can do within the Army, within DOD, to improve spousal hiring, because what you find, and everywhere I go, I meet with spouses. Every post I visit, I meet with the spouses. And you know, in most cases, they want to work, they need to work, they want to contribute and stay busy. So we are really doing a number of things across multiple fronts to reduce our bureaucracy, to improve spousal hiring. I appreciate what's coming out of the White House with regard to putting an emphasis on spousal hiring as well. And as I talk to members of Congress everywhere I go, they understand this challenge and are more than willing to consider legislative changes also to help our spouses. They are the most overqualified and underemployed cohort in America, military spouses. And so I think we can do better with them.
We talked earlier about sort of the change in the training standards. What role do you think women will play in the Army in the future? What opportunities will be open to them and what won't be open to them?
Well, everything's open to them right now, and they are performing well. I've had the chance everywhere I go to meet with some of the young women, officers and enlisted who are serving. My first trip in the Army was to the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California. So again, that's the premier training center. Gives you your best assessment. Gave me my best assessment of where we are, where we're training, and we're training against what the Russians were doing, for example, in Ukraine. But anyways, I had a chance to sit down and meet with a platoon of soldiers, and it was a mixed platoon of men and women. And I'll tell you, the women are tough. They're hanging in there. They're setting the example. All they ask is that they be treated equally. They be treated fairly. And they want to meet all the same standards, and they do. They're exceeding. They're excelling. And I got that message not just from the 1st Cavalry, but I got that message when I met with a unit at the 82nd Airborne. And just 2 weeks ago, I was at the 101st Airborne Division doing PT with the soldiers in the morning, and there was a brand new second lieutenant. She just graduated Ranger School, and she was doing her, I think, her first PT with the unit, and she was, she was all after it, just excited about doing the job and doing well. So.
And before we open it up to your questions, I want to talk about what may be one of the most important planks of the strategy, which is leadership and character. How do you define character?
The bumper sticker would be just do the right thing. Do the right thing. And most people know what that is. It's everything from treating everybody with dignity and respect to for me, as I like to tell my soldiers, the leaders, is live the Army values. We got 7 of them that talk about selfless service and duty and honor, those types of things. Hold true to those. They are a bedrock of our profession of arms. They are the reasons why I think that the military is held in such high regard by the American public, may be the single institution that really, year after year, ranks highest with regard to how the American people view their institutions of government. So it's a treasure. It's something we cannot afford to squander. It's what makes us, I think, unique in many ways, that we hold ourselves to a higher standard, and I particularly hold our leaders to a higher standard as well, because the commitment to those values will hold us well in the years to come in whatever situation may arise as this world gets more complex and more dangerous.
Before I open it up to questions, I have a selfish question for James, the 13-year-old. He wants to know.
He can go infantry.
No, that's right. He's going tanks.
Okay, that's great. Tanks. That's good too. There you go. You got to vote from there, from General Swan.
But on a serious note, for young men and women who want to choose a career in the Army, what kinds of subjects and skills should they be building now so that they are where they need to be a decade from now?
I would say 2 things come to mind immediately. You got to be physically fit. And that means, exercising every day, repetitions, but make sure you build a sound mind and a sound body, right? That old Greek maxim, if you will, sound mind and a sound body. So first of all, physical fitness is key. It's the foundation for being a good soldier. But secondly, I would say, you study a broad range of subjects. If anything, if there's an emphasis, it would be an emphasis in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. But study a broad range of things. We need people, we need leaders who can think, who can understand the basics behind a complex weapon system. Leaders who can write and communicate. I mean, a big facet of leadership is communicating ideas and thoughts and persuading others about the importance of the mission, why we need to do something. So, develop a broad spectrum of capabilities. I think third would be get involved. Get involved in your community, in sports teams and clubs, because that's where you learn the value of teamwork, where you learn the importance of leadership as well. That's what I see. I view as critical to building young men and women of character and young future leaders, or those types of things.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we're going to open it up for some questions. I see a question right here in the purple. Just give us your name. If you've served, we're interested in a couple of details, and then your question.
And if it's a really hard one, I'll dodge it.
It is, but Charlie Dine from Duke University, retired military, served almost 35 years.
Thank you.
In the Air Force.
The chief would say it's a good alternative to military service.
Well done.
I didn't say that.
I didn't.
Well done. And just for...
I love my Air Force partners.
We can rewind. No.
Hey, remember, I'm a lawyer, so... Just for our history buffs, I think the last time Army artillery sunk a ship was at Midway during World War II.
Oh, right.
Well, there you have it.
It's been a while.
We're coming back. That's all I'm going to say. We're coming back.
What I really wanted to ask you about, you talked a lot about AI, and here we have last December, Google established an AI research center in Beijing. Mm-hmm. More recently, as you probably know, with Project Maven, an AI project that intended to help, among other things, reduce civilian casualties. Google has pulled out of it. So what, if anything, can we do about that? And what message would you have for the tech industry in supporting our national defense?
Well, I guess what I would say is this, you know, the United States military exists to defend the Constitution and our way of life and all the freedoms we enjoy. And one of those freedoms is the freedom to live in a market economy, to try your hand at building technology, whatever the case may be. We give them the freedom to do that. So this is really about protecting American lives, protecting our country, and doing those types of things. And that's the message I would send. There's nothing nefarious here, if you will. But how do we leverage the technologies that are out there to help us, again, continue to build this community of democracies out there to defend, again, our great country, our way of life, the freedoms that we enjoy. I will say, so much is happening these days in the private sector. That's one reason why, a major reason why, we decided to A, stand up Army Futures Command, and B, put it in Austin, Texas. The ecosystem there of innovation, of entrepreneurialism, of high-tech know-how is just exceptional. And we want to be there on the ground working side by side with them. And I think the ability to go into a center like that, a city like that, and work side by side with tech companies, with tech entrepreneurs will help address some of those issues, those concerns that they may have.
You should come to Raleigh-Durham, but besides that, should we have some sort of CFIUS-type process for companies that are choosing to establish research centers in artificial intelligence and other high technologies that are of extreme value for future weapons when they want to put them in potentially adversary countries?
I think that's a good consideration that I know Congress is considering that now, and we leave it up to them to tease that one out.
Okay, another question, right down here in the front.
Secretary Esper, thanks for coming out and doing this. My name is Alan Estevez. I'm with Deloitte, former DOD official, 36 years with the department. Mike Murray's a great pick, by the way.
Thank you for your service, too.
I want to talk about the budget. So you're fortunate to have come in at a time where the budget got plussed up, much needed plus up. I wish I had the budget that you were operating with, but that's not guaranteed over time. So as you look to grow the force to about 500,000 plus the reserves and National Guard, eventually that's going to come into, they're going to need to square that against modernization programs, fairly ambitious modernization programs, again, much needed for the Army, and your readiness structure. How are you looking to do that?
Well, let me say, first of all, we did get good funding in 17, better funding in 18, and hopefully great funding in 19 as well. So I go a great deal thanks to Congress in bipartisan fashion doing that. And you're right, I don't know what's going to happen in 20, 21, 22, and beyond. Most members of Congress would have told us publicly and privately that don't count on more funding money being there. It could flatten out, it could taper down. My view is this, there are things I can control and I can't control. And I want to control as much of my future, the Army's future, as I can. So what the Chief of Staff and I began a couple months ago, 3 months ago or so, to get a handle on the budget was go through our modernization budget. It's one of 5 or 6 that are out there. And we made some tough decisions to free up the money we need to ensure that even if the budget doesn't continue on a trajectory that it is, we'll be able to maintain funding for our priorities for long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicle, future vertical lift, the network, air and missile defense, and soldier lethality. There's a lot of money in these budgets, but it just takes a clear-eyed, hard-nosed approach to reprioritizing what it is, and we've done that. And we got to go through other parts of the budget as well, but we are committed to controlling as much of our own destiny as we can. That means many programs will be killed, many will be reduced in the process. But it's important, if I'm going to make sure that I put soldiers on the battlefield in the future, that they have the tools, equipment, and weapons they need to fight and win. And that's my commitment, that's my obligation, if you will.
What was one of the tough cuts?
Oh, I won't talk cuts right now.
Okay. All right. See Kim Dozier right there, please.
Secretary, can you give us any clarity on the Army's policy on immigrants who've joined and are serving honorably and joined to get U.S. citizenship? Are they having to be expelled from the force?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think you're talking about the MAVNI program, Military Accessions Vital to the National Interest. This is a program that was stood up years ago. It's an OSD program, by the way, OSD program, and it has provided us important important recruits coming in on a couple particular areas, but I will tell you that as I understand it, as I believe DOD has briefed it, no person has been separated or removed from the service because they're immigrants. No one. A big piece of this policy, of this approach, is making sure, though, that they came into the service properly, were properly vetted, and the background checks they passed the background checks. So that's the important piece of that, and I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, over in the corner.
Thank you. Andy Weber, Counsel on Strategic Risks, former DOD. I have a question. We hear a lot about North Korea's nuclear weapons, but not so much about their advanced biological weapons programs. And the Army is the executive agent for biodefense. So I just want to ask you, what's your vision for biodefense, and where is it on your list of priorities?
Yeah. It's a good question. I won't speak to any threats or intelligence, but I will tell you this much. As we talk about the Army vision, one of the things you want to do in terms of a vision is provide sufficient, it's enough of a goal out there, a future, if you will, end state, but enough detail to make sure that you can achieve that aspiration. So as we wrote the Army vision, and you can see it here as Catherine waved around, we broke it down in terms of manning, organizing, training, equipping, et cetera, the force. Under the organizing piece of this, we know that going forward, we need to do a few things, and that is we need to restore capabilities back to our brigade combat teams and our divisions across a number of fronts. These are capabilities that we used to have in my day in the Army, we used to have them in. Consider, for example, artillery, engineer bridging capabilities, mobile air and missile defense. Another one, though, is NBC, what we used to call nuclear biological capabilities. Today, I think we use the term sovereignty. We need to put those capabilities back into the units so that we can deal on the modern battlefield with chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, you name it. But I have to put those capabilities back into the formations alongside EW and cyber. And so as we talked earlier about growing the force, I told you about the need to grow above 500,000 across all three components. People say, why? Well, the why is because, first of all, I have to fill out the units I have. I have to make sure that they're fully manned. Secondly, I have to restore capabilities that we gave up years ago, and one of them is that piece of it. The third piece is putting new capabilities into the force so I can deal with the threats we see in 2028 and beyond. Long answer, but I hope that helps.
Okay, another question just down here in the front, please. Senator, yes, I'm sorry, pardon me. Just stand by 1 second. Thank you.
I'm Edmund Thomas. I was an airborne infantry officer, and thank you for your service.
No, thank you, sir.
You have made me feel very secure about the Army's potential in the future. However, last year, or year before, we heard from General Dunsford here. And General Dunsford said that in 2000, he would have thought that our military would be superior long into the future. And then he came back and said, but today, I cannot guarantee military superiority past 2018. All you have told us was the future. Do we have a gap? Because we still have the Black Hawk, the Abrams, the Bradley, et cetera, which were 1980 developments. Do we still have military superiority into the future? Do you agree or not agree with General Dunsford?
I would say this. We are prepared to fight and win today. Hands down. We are prepared to fight and win today. With regard to those weapon systems, the Black Hawk, Patriot, all this that we talked about, the systems I grew up with and it sounds like you served with as well. We've made great investments over the years to continually upgrade them so that they remain very capable, very cutting-edge systems on a modern battlefield. The challenge is that those upgrades in some cases have reached the limit of what we can do. Case in point is the Bradley fighting vehicle. It's now achieved a weight, if you will, that makes it difficult in terms of the weight it can bear with its chassis, its transmission, things like that. It's reached a point in terms of the power capability it has to employ systems like active protective systems. So that's why when I talk about one of the 6 priorities, number 2 being next generation combat vehicle, that is the vehicle that we need to upgrade, that we need to replace now. We need to get to the next system, a system that is more capable, retains that overmatch with the Russians, and then will allow us to continue over the decades, again, an upgrade program. But I can assure you we're ready to fight and win today.
Guy Swan in the front.
Mr. Secretary, yesterday we had a good discussion about Europe, Russia, and of course we just had the NATO summit here recently. Could you talk about the Army's posture in Europe, and I'm talking specifically about rotational forces versus the discussion about basing forces back in Europe?
Sure.
At least Army forces.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you, I made my first trip back to Europe in January, and I commanded an airborne rifle company in Europe in the 90s, and so I had a lot of experience in Europe training and whatnot. One of the places I went to was the JMRC in Hohenfels, Germany, and one of the things I found really inspiring, really hopeful, was the fact that it's the European version, if you will, of NTC. We had allies were training together, U.S. forces underneath a Polish command with, Italian artillery, English recce units, British recce units, whatever the case may be, training as a multinational force. So a great deal of capability, much better than what I recall during my years of service 20, 25 years prior. I also had the chance to make it up to Poland. I traversed west to east to Poland and visit our soldiers there. And again, doing a lot of great things. Our allies in Poland and then, of course, in the Baltics get great reassurance from our capabilities, what we bring there, our presence. There is that question about, well, do we continue rotational forces or not? It's something that we continually look at. I will tell you that we get great training benefit out of picking up a force from the United States and moving it to Europe, offloading it and deploying it to positions. The ability to strategically move is critical to the Army's relevance. And that gives us a great opportunity to exercise those forces, something we hadn't done in years. The other thing it gives us, too, is until those training areas, at least in the northern part of Europe, become more mature, what we typically see is as a unit leaves the NTC and loads and ships overseas, once they get on the ground, they start seeing some degradation in readiness. And by the time they're at the end of that 9-month deployment, they're ready to come back and go back in the cycle. So a 9-month rotation allows us to keep really a high readiness force focused on the mission, too, because they don't have families around and things they need to take care of, and to really provide that reassurance, that deterrence mission that we need to do over there right now.
I have a question before I go to the audience again, because we'll have a chance for about 2 more. There's a panel this morning on Afghanistan, and one of the main takeaways was the need for the U.S. to stay engaged. What do you think the Army's role looks like in Afghanistan and the footprint?
Well, we talk about a lot of change underway in the Army, a renaissance. I spoke to the gentleman back there about organizing things we're doing differently. One of the things that we've stood up are these security force assistance brigades. And they have the virtue of doing 2 things. The first one is over there now. I was in Afghanistan 2-3 weeks ago, and I had a chance to visit with them, 3 of the battalions across the country. And what they provide us are, first of all, they will relieve an infantry brigade combat team of breaking itself up, losing a good deal of readiness that it needs for other fights. But more importantly, maybe, they also provide a highly trained, well-equipped group of experts in doing the train, advise, and assist mission to help our Afghan partners do what they need to do on the modern battlefield with Afghans leading, taking on the Taliban and others. So I think that's the future with regard to Afghanistan when it comes to the Army footprint and what we'll be doing. The SFABs are a great innovation. Chief of Staff of the Army deserves good credit for that.
One last question, and then we'll need to wrap it up. The gentleman here, please. Oh. Okay, 2, but quick. It's very clever.
Mr. Secretary, Tom Spohr, former Army officer and now at the Herridge Foundation as a defense researcher. You've talked about growing the Army at least as big as 500,000. We would agree with that assessment. We're also aware that in 2018 the Army had to reduce its recruiting goals by about 4,000, presumably at least because of a challenge of getting new people to sign up. How confident are you that the Army and the other services will be able to continue to recruit qualified volunteers? And if you have concerns, do you think the Army has the tools it needs to recruit, or is this going to require more, maybe a whole of government approach of some kind that we don't see today?
Good question. First of all, we did not lower our recruiting goals. They were lowered by Congress when the final National Defense Authorization came back. It told us we had to drop down by 2,500 soldiers, so it wasn't something driven by us. Second, and this has just been misreported, that's why I want to make sure we get it right. The second thing is we've done a great job in terms of retention. We have our highest retention levels ever. So because we were retaining more, that also brought our accessions missions down by another 1,000 or 1,500. And that's what reduced our overall number, not some arbitrary decision. That said, in FY19, we've requested 4,000 additional soldiers. I think that'll be the steady state, modest type of growth we want to see over the coming years. 4,000 gives us a clear line. I can configure my training base to do that, to get that lined up, the budget, the resources I need to do that. So I think that's fully manageable. On the recruiting front, we're doing two things. First of all, we're raising standards. I've already taken some actions where I said that the Army is going to raise the bar on recruitment of Cat 4s. DoD standard says no more than 4%. I've already directed no more than 2%. And there are other things that are in the works right now to make sure that we get we maintain a high quality level of our forces coming in. The recruiting challenge gets back, part of it is the bigger issue we talked about in terms of the increasing isolation of the military from its broader partners. But there's a whole lot more we can do in the Army and a whole lot better. So we have set into motion a number of things that will set the conditions for FY19 to make sure we meet our training goals with high-quality troops. We've expanded the number of recruiters. We are upgrading our recruiting storefronts, our stations, if you will. We're looking at how we move them in different parts of the country, right? Go where the kids are. Go to the big cities, for example. We're looking, right now we've initiated a program where we have soldiers coming who are currently on active duty going back to their hometowns, spending some time back to their schools, talking to former classmates or people they live with to talk to the Army. We're seeing great success from that already. We have to revitalize our Army marketing campaign. I think it just has been insufficient the past few years, so a lot of work underway there. The chief and I met with the head of what's called AMRG the other day to discuss about this. So there are a number of things we have to do, and even more that I could get into boring detail about. But we really need to up our game in terms of the message we send out, where we recruit, how we recruit, et cetera, et cetera. I've done my part. I've gotten Catherine's son on board. So I've met my quota for the day. But there are a number of things we need to do, and we're working on that one. But the key is steady, modest growth to get us to achieve that vision with high-quality soldiers. High quality is what we need to do, what we need to do in the coming years.
And as a courtesy, that final question, if you can keep it
and I'll be quick in my response.
I'll make it as quick as I can. Mr. Secretary, Tom Roeder with the Gazette out of Colorado Springs. What parts of Space and Missile Defense Command belong in a Space Force?
Had to take that one, huh?
Yeah.
I haven't studied the issue. It really has not been my focus. The Army relies heavily on space in terms of, for example, things like precision navigation and timing, those types of things. So we are a big user of space. Whoever runs Space Force, whatever the case may be, we'll plug in. We'll make it work.
All right. Just any final thoughts?
I'll just wrap up with where I began and reassure you all of, again, three things. Your Army is ready today to deploy, fight, and win. Secondly, there is a lot of change underway in today's environment. There's big change required. And I think we have the vision, I think we have the leadership, the momentum, the initiatives underway to make sure we make that reality so that America continues to be at the forefront and have the world's premier fighting force. And I ask you just, and third, I'd ask you just watch the news. There's a lot of great change underway in the Army. This renaissance is upon us, and a lot of exciting things happen, and I appreciate all of your support going forward.
Secretary Esper, I would like to thank you. It's been a real privilege to work with you and your team. I'd also like to thank your wife, Leah, and your kids for their service as well. And thanks to all of you who've been part of the conversation today, and thanks to Aspen.
Okay.
Thank you very much.